A huge welcome to everyone joining us today, particularly if you're new to Achates Inspires. I'm Fiona English. I'm the Director of Strategy here at Achates. Achates is a fundraising strategy and recruitment consultancy, and we're delighted to be hosting today's conversation with three fantastic panelists on political and artistic freedom. Today's conversation was correct at the time of our recording, I should say, which is in early February 2024, and will be broadcast at 1 p.m. on the 20th of February, when Achates colleagues will be on hand to answer any questions via the comments section. With that in mind, I'm delighted to introduce you to our panelists, who I'll get to say hello. Alia.
Hello.
Daniel.
Hello.
And Sean.
Hi.
Thanks all. I'll give an introduction to the panelists once I've set some context for you as to what we'll be talking about today. Artists and creatives have always been at the forefront of the conversations around freedom of expression, holding up the mirror to society as well as political freedoms. Inevitably, this has implications for culture itself, the role it has in society, and what freedoms the organisations that create and curate should have, and what limitations those freedoms should have, freedom of expression being a qualified human right. These issues have taken on a new resonance at a time when efforts to polarise people and ideas through the so-called cultural wars are powerful political tools. Most cultural organisations now operate as charities, which means they must operate in line with charity law, with oversight from the Charity Commission. But the arm's length principle between the state and the Charity Commission, as with many statutory bodies, eroded, and charities are being more closely scrutinised than ever for taking political positions that oppose government policy. Under charity law, a charity cannot exist for political purpose and can legally only comment on subjects which are within its defined articles. For example, when Achates supported Good Chance in its charitable registration, it was important that Good Chance registered as an arts and human rights organisation. Otherwise, it would have been unable to comment on the conditions in the camp for performance as opposed to human rights issues. However, when presenting an artwork which itself has political commentary within it, things become particularly complex. When we offer a platform for political comment, there is an inherent tension in the parameters of what these stages and platforms can be used for, and how the institution itself responds to the comment of the artist. If an artist puts forward the viewpoint of an artist on, say, conflict, does the institution have the responsibility to put forward an opposing viewpoint, or does that sense of pressure to do so depend on what the conflict is? And what about organisations seeking to independently stand behind a people or a group by making a political statement, such as flying the EU flag after Brexit, or the Ukrainian flag after the Russian invasion, or indeed advocating for the rights of Palestinians in Gaza in the current conflict there? In a statement published on the 21st of November 2023, Arts Centre the Arnolfini in Bristol confirmed it would not host two events as part of the Palestinian Film Festival, citing reasons around difficulties of arts charities hosting events being construed as political activity. This has led to significant backlash from the cultural sector, with protests against the decision and artists refusing to work with the Arnolfini, accusing the organisation of censorship. At the same time, governments, political and religious groups, along with the social media platforms and private individuals, are censoring and even destroying artistic freedom and work which is in opposition to their views. This compromisation of artistic freedom and freedom of political and social commentary risks creating an oppressive society where no one is able to question or present an alternative viewpoint, even if the means through which that's done are artistic. If the arts are indeed to reflect society, present an alternative view, challenge us even, how can we support artists to do this? What is our responsibility to our audiences, key stakeholders, and to ensure that our organisations continue to do so? Is it possible to, and if so, how do you balance the different backgrounds and perspectives of your audiences? What is our responsibility with regards to providing a platform for this artistic expression? We know that a number of cultural charities have recently had to take legal advice on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, following calls on the cultural sector to speak out against the war through petitions, walkouts, and the ability to use the sector's soft power to influence government and political leaders. Organisations such as Artists for Palestine, launched in 2015, providing a network of artists and cultural workers standing together for Palestinian rights and for a just resolution for all in Israel-Palestine, including for Palestinian refugees, has been at the forefront of this, reminding organisations of their ability to be able to take a political position while not contravening their objectives. How do cultural charities provide a platform for expression and avoid censorship, whilst ensuring they do not contravene their charitable objectives? The cultural sector has often been at the forefront of political and societal change. So what should be our role going forward? How do we ensure the safety of artists when providing these platforms? How do we balance artistic expression with staff making political commentary or expression? How do we respond to staff who are calling out for our arts organisations to do something? Today, we will explore just some of these questions and the role of the cultural sector in politics. With that in mind, I'm delighted to give you a little bit more context to our panellists. So firstly, Alia. Alia is the Artistic Director and CEO of Shubbak, the UK's foremost festival of contemporary Arab culture, a cultural strategist, curator and facilitator working in the intersection of art and social and environmental justice. Her practice uses the arts to interrogate the fundamental causes of inequality and explore models of understanding the world and being in it. She strives to co-create critical encounters in education and the arts towards collective liberation and has curated a range of interactives and creative disruptions from local corner shops to world-renowned museums. Alia is a Claw Fellow and Associate and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and volunteers as a coach and mentor with those facing systemic barriers to opportunity in the cultural and creative industries. We were also joined by Daniel. Daniel joined English Pen as director in August 2019. Prior to English Pen, Daniel was the executive director of Shubbak, Europe's largest festival of contemporary Arab culture, as just mentioned. Daniel is also a co-founder of Highlight Arts, who have organised UK-based international arts festivals and events since 2007, including projects working with writers in Pakistan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. Daniel has written for The Guardian, Irish Times, N+1, and many others, and contributed an essay to the Pen-supported volume Syria Speaks, Arts and Culture from the Frontline. Daniel is a National Arts Strategies CEO Community and Culture 2015 Fellow and a British Council Cultural Leadership International Fellow. And Sean Egan. Sean works as a lawyer across the creative industries. He is passionate about the arts and helping people achieve their objectives. He has enjoyed sitting on boards of institutions and organisations, and through assisting these organisations, he has developed a deep understanding not just of the legal issues facing the governance and management of charities and other not-for-profit organisations, but also has an ability to identify the important business considerations. He advises individual artists as well as organisations. Part of this is advising on the different range of legal structures available. He writes articles, gives talks, and contributes to publications. Thank you so much to all of them for joining. I also want to start this conversation quite rarely on Achates Inspires, but noting that this is a hotly debated topic and perhaps one that is fraught with a range of emotions that other topics might not have. And with that in mind, I would like to say that I've given all of the panelists the chance to step away from points of conversation should they not wish to discuss things. We understand that in discussing such a hotly debated topic that potentially has consequences that are far-reaching outside of just this conversation, there is a grounds that might cause upset, distress, even personal consequence in a way that other conversations might not. And I'm hugely grateful, therefore, even more so for them to all take that step forward in choosing to debate with me today the role of political and artistic freedom. So with all that in mind and all that context, I'd like to start by understanding Alia and Daniel, both in running quite different organisations, but ones where you've both had roots in similar ones, how you manage this delicate balance of political versus artistic freedom within your organisation. Daniel, would you mind if I started with you?
No, that's fine. And thank you so much, Fiona, and all of the Caseys for hosting this important discussion. It's a real honor to be here and with such wonderful co-panelists. I'm really thrilled to be able to take part. So yeah, the question of managing political and artistic freedom is, as you've said, a complex one, and I think you have to take it on an organization by organization approach. English Pen, although thank you for reading out my bio. I realized when you were reading it that my bio doesn't really say much about what we do, and so English Pen exists to promote and protect the freedom to write and the freedom to read. We are essentially a writers organization, a writers association. We were founded in 1921, so it's one of the oldest human rights organizations in the world, to protect that freedom to write and freedom to read. And we campaign to defend writers and readers in the UK and around the world whose right to freedom of expression is at risk. We're also the founding center of PEN International. PEN is a global movement, a worldwide writers association with currently, I think, around about 130 centers in more than 90 countries. So we have, I suppose, the benefit of being part of this global conversation around this topic of protecting artistic and political freedom. And in every context, it will have a different expression of how to best protect that freedom of expression. I suppose there's a number of points that I wanted to bring up initially. One is that I think there's a distinction to make between what the organization is saying and organizational statements and what the artists that we are hosting are saying. And that, I'm sure we will keep coming back to that throughout, because I think as arts organizations, many of which are registered charities, there are limitations, legal limitations in terms of what we as organizations can say. And it's really wonderful to be joined by Sean Egan here, who can talk maybe to that. There may be legal restrictions around that, but then at the same time, we want to be able to protect the artistic freedom first and foremost of the artists we work with, and as PEN, we're a writers organization. We work to support writers and for their freedom of expression. And so as we are doing so, I think there are certain questions we need to ask ourselves about. If we want to be able to take risks, we want to be able to do so and challenge ourselves and open up space for audiences to feel intellectually stimulated and challenged. And if we are doing so, how do we best protect and support the artists we're working with, our team, this staff team who are going to be working on that, and obviously our community, both the audience and the wider community that we work with. And there are various different strategies for that, which I think we can talk through a little bit more also over the course of this conversation. I think things to think about are what others are saying in the space, what other organizations are doing in this space. How do we speak to each other? Having networks that we can speak to each other are really vital. Having space for those kind of behind the scenes conversations to try and think through what our best approach might be and what is the most useful approach to be, with that baseline again of artistic freedom. And I think, I think in your introduction, you brought up the question of balance. And I think it's important to reflect that we can never have balance. And I think nor should we necessarily aim for it. I think we need to think through what we hope to achieve with the programming that we do. And we always make choices in our curation and in our curatorial selections. So when we're making those choices, I think interrogating a bit as to why we are making those choices and why we are making those decisions. And if the decision is that we are concerned about the risks in going down one route, then that's when you have those conversations internally, maybe with your board, and when you have the conversations with trusted partners to think through, if we want to achieve this is what we want to do. These are the kind of artists we want to host. Therefore, how do we best do that? That won't necessarily expose the artists primarily to more risk. And then obviously in any of this, if we're looking at the other side, which is what the organization is doing and saying, the first port of call is charitable objectives. English Pen, I suppose, is lucky that we are a human rights and arts organization, so our charitable objectives straddle both. But that also can be useful as ideally as a way for other organizations to be able to see what we are saying. Now we have specific work that we do, and when we make statements, or we amplify Penn International's statements. But that exists as a resource that people can make use of. And I think what's really key to think through is networks and resources that are already there. You know, we don't need to start from scratch every time. There are organizations, and we are only one amongst many brilliant organizations that exist that can be thought through and can be spoken to about what, you know, here's something that we're looking at. Can we have a confidential conversation to think through how we best approach it? Here are our charitable objectives. You know, what are the legal frameworks we can look at, etc. And I think in some ways it helps to spell things out as much as possible. So, you know, spelling out your vision, your mission, and your values, and therefore, you know, assessing what you're doing against those different frameworks is probably a useful first port of call. I think that's probably my opening gambit, but really happy to go into more of that. I'm sure there's a lot that I've missed there as well. I've kept it purposefully non-specific for now, but I'm really happy to go into the specifics as useful and around specific topics that we're looking at now or have done in the past.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Alia, if I could pass over to you, I think that intro rightly about specifically how we find that split between artists and organizations is something that must be particularly challenging at a network like Shubbak.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Dan. And thank you to all our colleagues at Achates for inviting us to have this, quite urgent, necessary conversation at this time. So Shubbak, speaking of charitable objectives, Shubbak exists to promote and raise awareness around Arab cultures and around the Swana region, Swana being Southwest Asia and North Africa. And in educating and raising awareness about the region through artistic works and expression, inevitably we're talking about a diverse, complex, polyphonic, artistic and cultural production that comes as a result. So it's a majority Arabic speaking region. We're constantly talking about identity. We're constantly questioning what that identity is. So for us to even start to thinking about political versus artistic is impossible. The two are not mutually exclusive. You cannot separate the person from the politics or the artist from the politics. Inevitably, a lot of the artistic expression reflects the world that we live in, reflects what narratives are being heard, if you like, or amplified, and which narratives are being silenced. And we need to say as it is that there are reductive, dehumanizing narratives that allow for violence, harm, and war to occur for the people, the artists that we represent and their communities. And so inevitably the work that's going to be created will reflect that these narratives exist and are having very real implications in the day-to-day lives, as we are witnessing in the war against Gaza, the atrocities being committed against Gaza. Today in Jenin, what others are calling quiet wars happening across Palestine, the war in Iraq, the war against Yemen, I can keep going. So from our perspective, again, to go back to Dan's point, it's not, we cannot silence that truth. It is the artist's truth. So when the artist comes and wants to present a work that is inevitably going to have these elements in them, it's our duty to platform these artists' voices. It's a truth that is out there. It is a perspective and a story and a lived experience that needs to be promoted or platformed, if you like, especially when these stories are being drowned out by these harmful, reductive narratives also that are around. So that's the first point, I think. That beautiful point that you made, actually, Fiona, to begin with, that the artists hold up a mirror to our world. And sometimes, going back to Dan's point and your point, the balance is not there. You know, we can talk about where the balance is. Is the balance about striking truth in the middle, if you like, or the truth is not always, if you like, in the middle of the balance. There's always a scope for movement, but I do really want us to think about blurring those. I suppose the issue becomes this neat qualification of this is art, this is politics, and this is human rights is deeply problematic for us. It's deeply problematic because it's not representative of what the world is and what we are as human beings, as artists, as cultural workers. We are messy beings. We don't distinguish within ourselves that this is political, this is artistic, this is human rights. We don't. And so why are we expecting that when we express ourselves, we're going to express ourselves in these categorized ways? We can't. So the other point I wanted to raise was the idea of political, there is a right kind of political that is okay to express, and there is a wrong kind of political that is not okay to express. And we experience that, our artists experience that all the time. So when artists are speaking about the liberation of Palestine, which is a perfectly acceptable aspiration, an aspiration for a people to be liberated and independent and self-governing, it's very curious to me that this is seen as the wrong kind of political, that this is suddenly political. We need to, so the Arnolfini's response, for example, that this is going to become, we cannot control that this is not going to become a political conversation. So that's suddenly, that kind of political conversation is a threat. But there are other people who are right now rightfully calling for their liberation, fighting for their liberation, and we don't see that as a political threat. We don't have the same kind of response to that there is, what if that conversation, that artistic space that is going to lead to that conversation might become a political threat that we want. So the double standard, I think, is important to speak about, and that's something we have to speak truth to power about, that we live through. I think ultimately what the bottom line for Shubbak is this: when we are holding these complexities and this messiness that we are as human beings, and as we said, that artists are able to pierce right through in so many ways to bring those stories out. The bottom line for us is, does it promote hate? Is it promoting the diminishing or the degradation of others, of species of the earth, our only home, of other human beings? Does it? If it doesn't, if it's controversial and it's asking us questions and it's unsettling us a little bit, then really is that problematic? Is that an issue? So I think it's just really important that we hold artists when they are holding this mirror, as you said, this critical mirror against structural oppression that exists in the world, that is so much more palpable for some of us than others. And to enable that really is part of the bravery that we have to have in the midst of situations like the one we are facing today.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I think that question, does it promote hate, is such a powerful provocation back to us. And you also said there, which I found so helpful, it's our duty to platform these voices, particularly when these narratives are being drowned out. And I think that question of duty and what is our responsibility as organizations is definitely one that is at the crux of this, of where that artist organization split comes. And Sean, hopefully that's an okay time for me to pull you in and ask if you can share some of those parameters for expression that we as cultural charities often, but organizations are facing. And I guess I'm particularly interested in if you think that cultural charities understand sufficiently what these parameters are.
Absolutely. I think this is a hugely complicated area. And I think that if I can just build up in the way I think about this, which I hope will be helpful. The way this country's constitution is meant to work is that you can do anything you like as long as it's not prohibited. And so it's about identifying laws and reasons for not doing things that is quite important. And so in the context of charities, we have Charity Commission guidance about political activity. And I think what Alia's comments absolutely highlight is there is a sense in which this is rather out of date, in the sense that it talks about, and I'm reading from it here, political activity is about campaigning to change or influence policies or decisions taken by governments, public bodies, that sort of thing. Now, I think what Ali is absolutely focusing on is that the term politics and a political stance is absolutely intrinsic to every act of many artists. It's part of the air they breathe. It's not in itself, well, it's open to debate whether these sorts of artworks are campaigning or not, but they're not necessarily explicitly campaigning, but they are part of a belief which is necessarily objecting to the status quo. And that's not necessarily explicit, but it's implicit in what they do. Now, forgive me, I hope I've understood correctly, and that, Alia, you would agree with as an approach. So for the Charity Commission to make judgments about political activity, we need to be specific about what they are saying is political activity and what is not political activity. And so I think that's quite an important first step. But you're absolutely right that in terms of charity law, you are allowed to undertake as a charity political activity, but you must do so within your objects, so your charitable objects. And to do so must be in the best interests of the organization. Now, that's all rather vague, and what Daniel and Alia do on a day-to-day basis is make decisions at the front line or whatever, sorry, but you know what I mean, whereas I'm advising on the principles. And I think that what I would start by saying is organizations need to think about how they can, in this very difficult area, justify what they do and how they do it, so that if a charity is speaking about Gaza and its objects are about housing, there's definitely an absolutely legitimate way of talking about that, as in if its objects are about religion or human rights. But the point is to be very mindful of what your charity objects are in the first place, because the justification of your involvement and expressing your views is rooted in those objects. I'd also like to pick up something that Daniel touched on, which is really important. And I think in some ways we've seen problems with the BBC. Their notion of impartiality is you present every view. That's not the requirement. In the context of charity law, it's about being able to justify what you say and how you say it if it's got a political context, rather than needing to show both sides or all sides. And I think it's I think the way in which the other thread, which I hope we will get onto, which is cancel culture and reputational risk, is a much more dealing with even if it's legal and you're not worried about it, do you dare do it? Which is, for me, as much a worry as whether the Charity Commission or other public bodies might frown upon what you do and how you're doing it. And I would also just acknowledge that the Charity Commission is one thing, but I think we are seeing the erosion of arm's length principles and the preparedness of government to get involved in areas that used to be outside their remit in terms of what is criminal, what is not criminal, and those sorts of areas which are complicating the issue enormously. So it is a very difficult and changing area, and it is. I think that people should support the artists as far as they can, because they are much more vulnerable, and the Charity Commission, its comments about organizations, needs to be mindful of the reality of how human rights work in practice.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And I think that that's a really important point to reference reputational risk. And I think there's some key words and phrases perhaps that we can unpack slightly, but definitely cancel culture being something that is a more recent phraseology, I would say. And perhaps a way that we can talk about that in this setting would be around duty of care to our artists and to our organisations, boards, decision makers. And that's not to avoid cancel culture. It's just for us to think in this context around organisations, we can perhaps touch further on it. And so, Alia, could I ask, we talked a lot there about artists having the opportunity to truly express what they believe is their civic duty, I would say, rather than just a political statement, but their civic need to comment on something they're passionate about. How do we support artists in that expression while also being mindful of that duty of care to them?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. It's a really interesting one, because the way I see it, our duty of care is the provision of platforms for artists who otherwise struggle to put on the very work that they need to be able to put on, especially right now when an unprecedented number of not just Palestinian artists, but artists from across the region and who live in the UK, who are coming to us saying, I'm having to self-censor and I need legal advice because the cultural institution which commissioned me or with which I am working is asking me to do X, Y, and Z. So there is the risk of loss of income. There is the risk of reputational damage that, the word is passed on to the next cultural institution. So this is the kind of duty of care we're now dealing with that feels the most urgent. The duty of care that says, you need to speak up about what you deem to be an injustice against your people. And this is through your artistic expression. This is absolutely your right to do so. And the fact that you are being silenced now is our duty of care. So what we are doing is we are, in as much as possible, supporting them in terms of what their rights might be. So, for example, really referring to the European Legal Support Center, which has been doing some incredible work for artists who are being censored at the moment and policed. Let's use the word, the artists are, in terms of what they are able to speak about and not, that they are being censored and policed. We've got the European Legal Support Center, which is inundated, by the way. As of, say, maybe about 2 weeks after the 7th of October, the European Legal Support Center became inundated, and now they're doing a brilliant job. They're getting all kinds of algorithms and tech support to be able to funnel through the requests that are coming through. But that tells us something, that they are so inundated that they are not able to respond. So that's our first duty of care, is to say, legally, here are your rights when this happens to you. And this is your strength, and here is your backbone, and we've got you. The other duty of care that has been an ongoing thing since our last festival in 2023 is what Dan referred to actually just before we kicked off, this notion of aftercare. So it's not just that an artist gets cancelled. So, for example, when the Barbican asked the artist Radio Al-Hara not to speak about Palestine, not to bring up the issue of Palestine. So at an event that they had coming up, and the artist then withdrew, rightfully. We shouldn't be asked what we are able to speak about and what we are. Is this a space for me, or is this not a space for me? To bring my whole self. So this is a very valid question for an artist. It is the notion of aftercare and restoration. And what we mean by that is, so any artists, whether it's Palestine or any other issue that is burning, that literally means the artist is sitting in the fire when they are creating the work and presenting it, then we provide aftercare spaces for them. And that is up to them what that aftercare looks like. And that's when we spoke to the Barbican as a result of the incident with Radio Al-Hara. That's what we asked them. We said, great that the event is now being put on, but there is a harm that has been done to this person and to other artists who are now thinking, oh, the Barbican is not for me. So what is the aftercare that comes around that?
Thank you. That's such a good point. And I think it further speaks to this reminder to us all that this is people's lives we're talking about, not just in terms of necessarily war context, but also in terms of people being denied their identity. And this is often the context that artists, organizations are having to sit within when making these choices of being told not to speak on things. And so you're quite right, that aftercare piece, how can we ensure as organizations we're not just providing fleeting moments with people that have impacts on them far beyond the instant, perhaps, cancel culture as we often see it, because the cancellation in that, we all know, goes far beyond that single moment. It's a really good point. Thank you. And there's maybe an interesting question in that Daniel, maybe I could ask you to pick up on, if you don't mind, about how we do give platforms, therefore, particularly on these hotter topics, these questions that would be seen as to offend. The Alia, your point there, you just said our duty of care is to take the risk as the organization. So how do we do that as organizations? How do we give platform to the riskier conversations?
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you so much, Alia and Sean, for your incredibly wise and useful and heartfelt points. And in terms of that question, I suppose around offense, right? So freedom of expression includes the right to offend, and we need to be very clear on that. And I think there's the question of who is being offended and why they are being offended. Alia has brought up the question, really thank you for this, around that kind of false distinction between artistic and political. Every piece of art has a political dimension, I would argue, or it can, at least it exists. We exist in a political world and life. So therefore, whatever we do and however we exist, there are political aspects to that. So trying to draw that line is impossible, of a distinction between the two. I would agree with that. And so I think a lot of it comes down to governmental positioning, and therefore, what is going with governmental positioning or what is going against governmental positioning in terms of what the artists are saying. Which brings in that question of power, which is vital for us, I think, to reflect on. So how do we support the right to be offensive, but at the same time protecting our artists and protecting our audiences in as we can. Now I don't want to. I'm going to paraphrase you, Alia, but if I get this wrong, please do join in. Because it seemed to me like you were saying the red line for you was around promotion of hatred, and I think that's for me personally. I think that's a pretty good place to draw a line. Now I think the kind of how you define that is up to each organization, and I think you have to think through very carefully, both in line with your objectives, charitable objectives, and your values of the organization. What that is. For us, we tend to draw a line around expression that undermines the internationally recognized human rights of others, incites hatred, and engenders the threat or use of violence. So that tends to be a kind of line which is fairly robust, I hope. And with that in mind, then we work with artists to try and support them to present the work that they want to present. That may be work that, you know, we personally also find, you know, is not to our taste or causes us offense. But if we're doing so, we will want to think through with them, okay, what are the risks that we're looking at here, trying to really map that out as much as possible in advance, so that we're going into a space where we're never going to know everything, obviously, because it's constantly changing context. But as much as possible, doing that thinking beforehand, which does not include going to the artists and saying, don't say this and don't do this. It's thinking through, they have got their vision, they've got their work that they're going to do, and therefore, how do we best facilitate that? I think the question of when artists are asked not to say something, and Alia, you brought up the case of Ray Alhala, that's a major issue. And I think the real risk also is that artists don't necessarily know where to go when that happens, you know, because artists tend to exist and work as individuals. They may have a community of artists, they may not, but, you know, I think there's a duty for us as organizations to say that we are here and you can come and you can speak to us, and opening that door as much as possible. You know, I mean, English Pen essentially exists for that reason around writers, and we really hope that people do feel comfortable to come to us. But we recognize that we have a duty to open that door as much as we possibly can. And it may be that individuals don't feel comfortable speaking to us, but may feel comfortable speaking to another partner organization, and then that partner comes to us. So I think it's kind of thinking through that ecosystem and infrastructure to ensure that artists are able to do the work that they want to do. And at the same time, as we said, thinking through things in advance as much as possible, and then thinking through that question of aftercare, which can be aftercare and should be aftercare for the individuals involved, you know, in terms of the artists. But there also, I think, can be thinking around aftercare for audiences as well, because we are in a very raw time. Human rights are under assault in many different ways, both here and internationally. You know, I would argue that we're in a human rights emergency. And so we never know how things will be received. There's both the kind of broadcast and reception question. And so as such, thinking through what that could be, and if there is more that we can do to try and provide resources to individuals, which can be, you know, a list of links that people can access, but just thinking it through in a more holistic fashion, I suppose. Thank you. That's so helpful. And I think it's, we touched on earlier, but that question of the choices that we make as curators will inevitably have far more broad-reaching responses from our audiences than perhaps our own individual viewpoint and narrative can see. And so trying to take in that framework, space, variance of opinions, I would argue a huge part of that has to be about the number of voices that are around that table on your boards, your staff teams, who's feeding into your narrative to start with, to ensure that you have as diverse a room of people as possible to create and curate the most diverse art that you can, but that also therefore speaks to the majority of audiences.
I'll come back to audiences if that's all right. I'm just particularly interested in that point of wanting to put on perhaps work that is, again, riskier for us as organizations. And when you're sitting, I think we often forget in this narrative, but when we're sitting in the CEO's seat, perhaps that can feel, I think, a really dangerous position, choosing to take on that reputational risk for your organization, and the legal implication that it might have, what you're asking of your board members as well to take on. And Sean, could I just ask perhaps how, when we are sitting in that seat, how we as charities can engage in political activity within the framework of our constitution?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the important considerations for any board is going to be, I mean, in the context, for instance, of an event, distinguishing between the views of the artist and the views of the organization, the charity, because I find it very difficult when a charity is trying to control or restrict what an artist is going to say or do. And it seems to me that you can have an event which is discussing important issues without every single thing said by every one of the speakers being automatically considered to be an expression of the views of the organization. And I think that we've got a lot of blurring of that. And I think that as a board, you would say, we are staging an event, for instance, to do this, to debate this, to discuss this, and we're inviting people who know about the issues and they can talk about it in a meaningful way. But that doesn't mean that every single word or statement everyone on the platform says is attributable to the organization. And I think that can be carefully managed. And I think that would be helpful to avoid the sort of situation that Alia is talking about, if that's possible. But then that leaves you with the self-censorship issue, which is so present, and organizations are scared. And the difficult thing is that it's almost easier to self-censor than to take the risk. And it is perfectly justified for organizations to take risks, because the idea of contributing to a cultural debate is in the best interest of the charity if it's a cultural charity. By sort of avoiding difficult topics, how is that in the best interests of the charity? So I think boards need to accept that they're allowed to get things wrong as long as they've thought about things and made a proper decision. Now, it's quite difficult for CEOs in this context, because do they run every single thing by the board? There needs to be an engagement so that the instincts of the CEO, as to what to refer to the board, what not to refer. I mean, it's always good for the organization to have shown that the board was engaged and did consider the issues and approved the actions going forward, because then it's not on the CEO's head. And it's just that it's about enabling the organization to do what it should be doing and finding ways of doing the right thing within the legal framework. I know that's a bit vague, but you know what I mean, I think.
Thank you. And I think we talked a bit early on about how unpacking more than so that your vision, mission, and values are truly understood and owned by your board, I think can have real power in that, so that those decisions don't exist within a single line mission statement, but there is a better thought through process that your entire staff team, board has been through, understood, and is engaged with, Knowing who your beneficiaries are as well, I would say, is a huge thing, so that you are aware who your communities are that you're serving and who your audiences are. I think often in cultural organizations, we use the phraseology audiences thinking about ticket buyers. But I would always encourage cultural organizations to think about audiences as anyone who is engaging with and connecting with the content that you're producing. That doesn't have to have a monetary exchange. And if we, as the staff teams, the CEOs and the boards are able to help artists by all being on board with who it is that is we're making our art for, who is going to be receptive of it, I think that can help as well in terms of us taking those risks and choosing to make those risks. And I think one of the questions that I'd like to focus on to finish, if that's all right, because we are running inevitably short of time, is I'm interested in how we as cultural charities can avoid censoring artists. And in particular, I want to, I guess, be mindful of the power that money has in these contexts. We're all aware, no doubt, those of us tuning in, of not just the power of government, Arts Council pressure. I mentioned offline at the very start of this conversation, and I'm not going to ask our panelists to comment on it, but just to observe the newly published relationship framework for NPO organisations from the Arts Council includes a section on reputational risk, specifically talking about being mindful against putting on activity that might be considered to be overtly political or activist. The Arts Council claims in a further section of this relationship framework that for the avoidance of doubt, we expect all NPOs to support freedom of expression. But we're aware that money has power, and often some of the censorship, I think, that takes place can be due to donors, board members, governments, or even paying ticket members. And that may be one way that censorship often gets in a way outside of just a cancel culture, the power of money. So I just want to leave that as a thought that I'm happy to say, rather than forcing our panelists to need to discuss perhaps the impact of funders in that. So just as a final gambit, if that's all right, a final question for each of you. How, as cultural charities, do we avoid censoring artists? Alia, if I can start with you.
How much time have I got, Fiona?
I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll keep it quick. I think it's really interesting, the question of reputational damage and the kind of what's becoming more and more of a controlling kind of space that we are dancing in, if you like. And it just feels like right now the issue of free speech and free political and artistic expression is a battle over who gets to define what is acceptable and what is not. And it's a battle we cannot give up on. This one. This is the one we cannot give up on. And I mean, the costs may be high, and we have an ecology, we have an ecosystem. Some of us are working within structures that are a little bit more rigid, so we can chip away from the inside. Some of us are on the outside, so we can be a little bit more radical, right? And it's about remembering that we are many in this, and that we have to be brave. It is up to us as cultural workers and knowledge producers to be brave. And I just want to bring in our wonderful elder ancestor who's no longer with us. In her seminal text, Sister Outsider, Audre Lorde said, it's not difference. It is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. So there's so many silences right now. There's so many silences, and it's really up to us to speak up.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, and thank you, Alia. That was brilliant. So I will try and be brief too, which is tricky. I think I'm just going to echo what both Alia and Sean have said around risk, and it's hard not to mention that the NPO guidance that came out. So thank you for bringing that up, Fiona, because one of the things that they suggest is that, once you've assessed, maybe an alternative lower risk course of action might be more appropriate. And that to me is fairly concerning, because I think, as has been said throughout this conversation, as arts organizations, it is our duty to take risks. And we need to think through what those risks are. And I think, about how we best engage with them, how we best engage our board, etc., is a thing for CEOs to think through. But as has been said, right now, there's a huge amount of silencing around Gaza, and we need to recognize that. And that is of concern of anyone who is following the situation in Gaza, and also anyone who is concerned around human rights and their erosion more broadly. And I think at the same time, there's the broader question of, once work that engages with that is defined as political and therefore not appropriate for your organization, what comes next? So I think we have to just be really aware of that, even if for some reason you're not engaged with that current situation and conflict. There is a much wider concern for all of us who care about presenting artistic and political work. And as Alia said, this is really critical for all of us who care about the arts and about the right to be able to express ourselves clearly. So I think, the way not to censor artists is to have, at this point, as much time as possible to speak to them, to really understand their vision, and then think through how we can best present it. And if there are concerns by artists about their free expression being limited, knowing where to turn to is critical. And so I think that thinking through that, as Alia said, there is a whole ecosystem here. You are not alone. So how do we best make use of that? And I think we, English Pen, other organizations have really an obligation to think through that more, about how we best open those doors and make sure that people are able to come and seek the resources that they need.
Thank you. And Sean?
I'd just like to reiterate that I think censorship can be helpfully dealt with by distinguishing between the artist and the organization. And then just on the Arts Council guidance, I think that the Arts Council needs to clarify what it means, because I think that there's plenty of legal guidance as to what charities, and most NPOs are charities, the legal guidance is there already. So I think that it would be helpful if our Arts Council could clarify whether they're talking about going beyond what is already in law. And I'd just be really grateful to hear their thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, all. And I just want to extend a further thank you to our panelists, not just for their time today, but for their bravery, their desire to speak about issues that we all know requires vulnerability, and also requires us to step over that threshold and to speak up in ways where often it's easier to be silent. So I'm really grateful to our panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and watching. Achates colleagues will be on our chat for the next 10 minutes to answer any questions that you might have. Please do feel free to reach out, or you are very welcome to reach out to me as well directly if something has affected you in particular in today's conversation. As a reminder, Achates can help with a range of support if you need it, from business planning to feasibility studies, recruitment support to organizational change, helping your boards to be on board with your missions, visions, and values. We really can support in any way. The next Achates Inspires will be in March, and we'll share more details about that topic later this month. But from all of us here at Achates, thank you ever so much for tuning in.